This happened Christmas night 2007 in upstate New York. The day had been pleasant and festive, opening presents early in the morning with my sisters, a hearty breakfast made by my dad, and delicious smells coming from the kitchen as my parents prepared a feast. Visits from extended family bringing pies and cakes for dessert. Around 2, we all sat down to eat and then lazed about for the rest of the afternoon into the evening. At about 8 o'clock, after everyone had left and all the food was put away for round 2 the following day, I decided to head over to visit my friend in the next village. The drive would be about 10 minutes if I took back roads to get there. First, a little background on where my friend lived. It was a housing development, surrounded by a private lake. You might call it a gated community. You could still drive through it freely after hours by entering one of 4 private entry points. Since the community was built around a lake, the roads surrounding it went in a spiral sort of shape. The houses were sparsely positioned on the outermost part of the spiral road, closest to the 4 private entry points. As you drove in further, there were a lot of more houses positioned closer, tighter together, nearer the lake. My friend lived on the outer edge of this development, so once I reached the entry point, it would only take me another few minutes until I reached his house. His house, along with all the others, were far enough apart that you couldn't see them from the road as you drove by. There were either woods all around with long drives or open fields with long drives. You could see porch lights on in the distance, but that was about it. As I entered into the development, the speed limit dropped from 30 miles an hour down to 20. There were no streetlights here for some reason, and I never put my high beams on. I couldn't go any faster than the speed limit because there were speed bumps in place every 30 feet or so. It was a mild night. I remember having my driver's side window open, taking in some fresh air. I remember driving in silence, which was unusual for me. I normally always listen to music. I must have just been enjoying the quietness after the commotion of the day. I reached a section of road that had barren fields on either side and woods set back. The houses were probably nestled back into the trees right where I was at. As I drove, I noticed what looked like something walking up ahead on the opposite side of the road, coming in my direction. Mind you, I was still going about 20 miles per hour the whole time, so it was probably less than a minute by the time the creature came into clear view. I got a quick scan of it from my windshield before my car and it were exactly parallel. This is what I saw. It was not a person. It stood on 2 long legs, with long arms hanging down from its shoulders. It was very strong looking, lean, muscular, but not beefy in stature. It looked thin at the same time and stood at least 7 foot tall. It was very light colored, but I'm not sure if it was white, tan, yellow, or grayish. It didn't appear to have fur, but there was some texture to the skin. It definitely wasn't smooth. There appeared to be something coming down off of its back. I don't know what this was. All I can recall about its face is the small features. The mouth and the jaw were notably large. It had 2 pointed things atop its head, kind of like horns. 2 things going straight upward with something mingled between them. That's what I got from the quick scan. As my car became parallel to it within a split second, I went from looking out my windshield to looking at it from my driver's side window. In that moment, its face quickly peered down at me, and all I remember was the mouth open wide. Out came a remarkable scream that I'll never forget. It gives me chills just thinking about it. It consisted of a high-pitched shrill or shriek, enveloped by a deep, guttural growl. Both sounds happened simultaneously in that scream. I kept driving all the while. This was all happening so fast I didn't even have a chance to be scared or shocked or anything. I continued driving and went past my friend's house and drove home. I called him to tell him what happened, and I just needed to get back. I was probably running on adrenaline to get back home. Later on, I was in total shock after it sunk in. Had my driver's side window been open fully, it could have touched me, or even worse, taken me. I'm certain of it. To this day, I still haven't worked out what this was, but I believe it could have been a Wendigo. I live in the middle of dozens of fields, laced with small wooded regions, all of which were once incredibly dense forests and swampland. My road has no street lamps or light aside from 2 porch lights that are barely ever lit. This is something I have been seeing and been afraid of my whole life. I see a tall figure, bigger than the corn stalks at full growth. A wide mouth and long snout, and its eyes aren't red, no, worse. They're black. I've seen it outside of the house on nights when I left my curtains open. It had these weird, sharp, spiny things jutting out from its skin. And its skin always looks like it's bleeding. Sometimes it's closer, sometimes it's far away, and other times not there at all. This thing is so terrifying we've never kept our dogs out for long at night, or us. The only time we leave the house at night is if we're with someone or it's not a long distance. But the not a long distance still isn't short enough for me. I feel like every time I turn my back to the night, it's running right at me. I find myself sprinting from my car on late nights. At one point, I was with a friend. He and I were talking about life and driving around the country roads where he lived. It's about 2 miles deep into the forested area, and we got to talking about old stories. He mentioned he never felt safe leaving his house at night, even to step 5 feet from the door. I told him the same, and that's when he described the tall figure, with bony things sticking out of its back and almost no meat at all on its bones. When I asked him whether or not he seen the eyes, he was silent. He and I don't hang out much anymore, but it sucks less knowing I'm not the only one. My grandmother swears to have seen things on these roads and in these fields. She and all the adults used to gather into the living room and talk about happy things. And as it got darker, so did the stories. I used to sit outside of the living room and eavesdrop when I was younger. It was terrifying to hear these, but my parents had seen the figure in the fields in mid-October. They said it moved like a big diseased dog, to quote my dad. It looked like a piece of dead skin with broken branches as antlers. I still haven't seen the antlers on it, but I think that what we've seen is a Wendigo, or maybe more than one. This is a story from my childhood. I'm in my 30s now. I grew up in the Northeast US. My family liked to spend time in the woods, and we had a cabin and often stayed there in the summer. I had a very traumatic childhood. My grandfather died when I was 4, and I took it really hard. I completely quit talking for about a month or so. I can't remember the not talking part, but I remember the nightmares from that time. Night after night, I would have a terrible dream where I was alone in the woods, and I would try to find my way out. I would run into this awful demon that had a deer skull for a head, and something like a human skeleton for a body, wrapped in tight gray skin. Once I would see it, all I could feel was absolute loneliness, and I would wake up screaming. The nightmares continued for about a month or so, then they slowly faded away. My kindergarten teacher told my mom I could probably use professional help, but I started speaking again shortly after, so my mom thought everything was fine. I'll never forget those nightmares. When I was a teenager, I couldn't sleep one night, and I started watching this movie on TV at about 2 a.m. It was called Wendigo. Once I saw the Wendigo, I nearly had a panic attack. It was almost exactly what I saw when I was young. This depiction had a deer head, not a deer skull, but that was really the only difference. And this movie was only made relatively recently. I read up on the Wendigo, and at the time I saw it in my dreams, I did feel desperately isolated and alone. It made me afraid to go into the woods by myself for years. You could try to rationalize it and think that I must have seen or heard about it before having the nightmares when I was little, but I don't think that's the case. And I think there's something kind of weird going on here. An ex-girlfriend of mine used to live on this small rural island in Minnesota called Gray Cloud Island. At one point, the island had the highest concentration of Indian burial grounds in the country. There's a lot of history there, and it was at one time considered sacred. At any rate, across the street from my ex's mailbox was a long, overgrown gravel driveway, blocked off by a rusty chain. On one of our late evening jaunts, we decided to step over the chain and make our way down this driveway, which was a good 1/4 of a mile long, if not more. The driveway opened up into a small clearing of sorts, in the center of which all that remained of a home was the foundation. Little more than a rectangular patch of concrete. The trees that circled the clearing were sparse in some places and thicker in others. But even so, we could see a lot of the ground beyond the clearing. Grassy, humped ground, trees, nothing else. My ex had a blanket, which she spread out on the patch of concrete. We lay down together and talked for a while, all the time listening to the chirp of the crickets. Dusk had just crept in, and we were still lying there when we heard movement in the woods nearby. The crackle of branches and crunching of leaves. It was very close. Much, much too close for comfort. From the sound of it, it was no more than 20 yards away. Surely we would have heard of its approach from a ways off. Sound has a tendency to carry in the woods. We got up by mutual, unspoken agreement and in the dark made our hasty but careful way to the driveway. That sound, the sound of something approaching from the woods, changed. It was now in the clearing where we had been only moments before. As scared as I'd ever been in my life, I started to break into a run. I was immediately grabbed by my girlfriend, who urgently whispered to me, "You can't run from it. It only provokes chase." I did as she said, and together in silence we moved back down the driveway. Moved as fast as we could without actually running. By the time we got to the street, the sounds were gone. I asked her what she thought it was. She looked at me very stone-faced and said, "I don't want to talk about it, and I really shouldn't." She was 100% Native American, and I knew she knew more than she was letting on. Regardless of how much I pried, she never told me what it was. But to this day, I think we may have been in the presence of a Wendigo.